5 very distinguished authors who have very kindly come along today. So I'd like to welcome Jim Crace, Tash Orr, Otto Ducat, Alison MacLeod and Justin Cartwright. One of the very striking things to have taken place during my reading life is the complete change in status of the historical novel. And I think over the last 40 years it's undergone a definite change in status. It wasn't so long ago that historical novels were rather looked down on. They were practiced by what was seen as genre writers like Alfred Duggan or Georgette Heyer. Since, in the last 40 years, perhaps a little bit more than that, since perhaps John Fowles wrote his outrageous Victorian romance, The French Lieutenant's Ball, it's descended. I'm doing my best. I'm not an operatic baritone. Since then, it's undergone all sorts of changes in authority. Novels like J.G. Farrell's The Siege of Krishnapur in the beginning of the 70s, William Golding's Seafaring trilogy, A.S. Byatt's Possession, moved the historical novel to the centre of literary endeavour, to the centre of our acclaim. One of the things that I'd like to ask the panel as the morning goes on is why they think this might have happened. But first of all, I'd like to start out by asking them individually to describe how their work relates to or contains the endeavour of the historical novel. Who shall I start with? Jim, why don't you start?
I'm baffled why I'm here. I've never written a historical novel. I'm being a bit cute when I say that. It's just that if you think of the phrase historical novel, it contains the word history, doesn't it? History is a record of things as they were in the past. And that's not what I've done. Maybe the historical novel is too wide a term. There are other things that historical novels, in quotes, can do. And that is to impose on the past, or to project on the past, an imaginary world which serves a modern purpose. And so if you read novels which are described as a historical novel, some of them are entirely trustworthy. You will read about Tudor England, and every fact that is related in that book will truly be measurable against known history. But then you're going to read books which are set in the past. Philip mentioned William Golding. He wrote a book called The Inheritors about a Neanderthal family moving from one ground to one area to another. Now, Golding could not possibly have known the detail of that journey, so it was entirely an invention, entirely an act of the imagination. So I'm very reluctant to call my books historical novels, because what that does, even though one was set in Judea 2,000 years ago, I've just written another novel which is set 500 years ago in the United Kingdom. I've set other novels in the past. These are not trustworthy novels. You should not read them and think you're going to learn anything. You are going to be misinformed. These novels don't hold any regard for the facts. They hold a regard for the different glancing truth that fiction is so famous for delivering.
Jim, I'm sorry, I didn't buy that. Your novels are fantastically related, not just to a specific time, but they give a wonderful sense of the imagined time. I mean, Harvest is a sensational book, and it gives you this extraordinary insight into what happened 500 years ago. I mean, I remember reading, when I read the book, I couldn't work out exactly when it was, and I plucked at the early part of the Closures, which is what?
Yes.
Roughly right?
Well, I wanted to fool you. But actually, you don't need to be a good liar. You actually don't need facts. It's not facts that makes you a good liar. If you go to a party and you want to persuade people you're a dentist, and you are a dentist, if you don't have the vocabulary, no one will believe you. So the key to writing good fiction set in the past is not the facts, which belong to the non-fiction writer. what is important is vocabulary. So I clothe myself in vocabulary, and I look people straight in the eye, and I hope that they don't spot that I'm making it up. And I'm not kidding when I tell you that my knowledge of medieval England and Tudor England or wherever that book was set is very, very shallow.
Can I ask one more question?
Well, we'll come on to
Yeah, because there's a point we may not get back to, sorry. But what you produce in Harvest is an alternative language, it's entirely authentic, but unlike some recent novels that bring up the bodies and so on, it doesn't feel invented, that's the trick. There's no archaisms and so on, somehow it feels totally right.
Good, but it isn't.
It's not about the fact, it's about the transformation, it's about the invention, it's about looking at the gaps, not what we know, but what we don't know. I was really interested in your talk on Saturday, Philip and Jim. Jim, you were saying in Philip's novel, The Northern Clemency, it's about, that we're really trying to locate the reader in Northern England, 1970s. And you were saying you were trying to dislocate the reader. That's sort of two different endeavours, two different ambitions, really. But surely, in my experience, you're trying to locate the reader to dislocate them. So yes, I was aware. I've got to get the facts as right as I can. I've got to be as scrupulous as I can. But really, what I want to do is to find, in this case, the surreal within the real. So you have to depart from this notion of chasing the facts.
Well, I make just, and then I'll shut up. I'll just make a distinction because both you and Justin and Philip have written novels which are set in the memorable past,
yes,
or just beyond it. So in a way, you can't get away with making stuff up.
You can't. No.
And there's a
no,
difference
you can't.
between history and memory.
Yeah.
And you have a duty of trust to
Yeah.
your readers.
Yeah.
You're describing, I'm thinking of other people's money and stuff in your book. That you have a duty you have a duty to your readers
You do.
to not misrepresent the world that they know.
No, it's true. It's
And
true.
so I'm immensely uncomfortable setting books in a recognisable present.
Yeah, it's scary.
Because I would have to tell the truth.
It's really hard. It's really hard not that. Yeah.
And that's a very good point, Jim, because memory and history is a little bit different from each other.
Yes.
And as a novel writer, if you set your novel in a period that people could know, then you have to be very, very specific in the detail. And for instance, what was the weather like when you write about a meeting in Lübeck in 1938, what I did?
Yeah.
And I wanted to have the weather right, because you can't stand it if there's one reader who remembers that it was raining. And they will, and you get letters.
Justin, can I ask you to talk now about the place that you think historical inquiry bears in your book? I think it's slightly more oblique than have others on this now.
I mean, there's no difference in the way I start between an ordinary novel and a historical novel. I've only written 2 historical novels that could be described as historical novels. But basically, I start with what John Updike called carpentry. So I always like to see the place. I like to try and I make notes anyway. And I never write about anything I haven't seen. So obviously, I couldn't ask Philip Pullman. It wouldn't work, because I've never seen the things he writes about. But what happened with the Song Before It's Sung, which is about 2 real people, Isaiah Berlin and Adam von Trott, who was hanged in 1944 by Hitler, was I had to be incredibly careful, and particularly careful with the facts, because it's such a sensitive subject, who was hanged, why they were hanged. And the family of both Isaiah Berlin and Adam von Trott, Stilter's family, who were looking over my shoulder. And the von Trott family, just briefly to give you the background, von Trott was an Oxford Rhodes Scholar who went back to Germany, joined the resistance, and was hanged in 1944. But the family were incredibly upset by my novel. I tried to explain it was a novel and I invented some things, but I'd been as true as I possibly could to the facts, but I got some quite vicious letters. oddly enough, it didn't worry me that much. I don't know why. Much worse for me is if somebody writes to me and says, you know, your punctuation is terrible. And that really upsets me. But yes, I think for me there's not a huge difference. In my latest book, The Lionheart, there's a dialogue. It's a sort of dialogue about the Crusades and about Richard the Lionheart. And there's quite a lot of material, and a lot of it, the Arabic material, funny enough, is much more accurate. It turns out the Arab accounts of what happened at the time of the Third Crusade were much more Greek in the sense that they weren't proving some mythology, which was the Christian approach. They were actually quite straightforward. So I used those. I'm not saying I found any. Well, I did in the Bodleian find a letter to Saladin, which I used as well. But yes, so I try and do the homework for like a regular modern novel, like Other People's Money, and for historical novels.
But don't you think that as a novel writer, you have to do your research very well, as you said, and very good and solid, but you have to forget it at the same time you're writing.
Yes.
You don't get too much to the facts and the figures, because otherwise you lose your character. I think history, as you use it, is more of a butler serving at the right time, at the right place, so to say. So, no, you don't have one. No.
I should say that Otto's familiarity with Butler perhaps comes from the fact he has a career as a publisher.
I do take your point, but I mean, what you're doing in a historical novel is exactly what you do in a modern novel. You don't want to overlay with endless facts. Nobody wants to. But you need a feeling that the writer knows what he's talking about.
That's right, and you might sort of cast away 80% of your research finally, but the fact that you've absorbed all that is a pressure pushing up between the lines, and it allows the reader to feel in safe hands. But I also think truth and facts are different in a novel. Truth is something that isn't necessarily always grounded in the specific facts. It's the bigger thing you're reaching towards, and again, you have to lie to tell the truth.
I think Philip made a very good point early on that historical novels have changed. They in some kind of slightly antique contemporary novels started this way.
Yes.
It was 6:32 on the steps of the Wannsee, and General so-and-so came in his Mercedes, pulled up outside exactly,
Yes.
that kind of stuff has really got to be ditched. You
Right.
have to enter into this world.
As a reader, I don't personally care whether every detail is correct. I don't think most readers do. I think people enter the world. People enter the world of fiction with a certain generosity of spirit.
Yes.
You want
Yes.
to discover. You actually forgive quite a few things. Well, actually, I find that the most realist of realist writers, they get letters of objection from people complaining about something. Every writer is always going to receive complaints. So, I mean, that's not really something that affects my opinion.
The most furious letter I ever had from a reader was from a reader who complained that I'd made her real-life grandmother walk downstairs. And it wasn't that she was disabled, it was that she would never have invited people to dinner and let them arrive while she was still upstairs. I've never been so aggressively attacked. Also, could I ask you then, taking up Tash's point, to defend your point about the necessary specificity of what the weather was like on that day in 1938? What is your approach to constructing a reality?
Well, I'm quite an instinctive writer. I do my research, and as I said, I forget it again. But to build up the atmosphere, I need specific tiny details I have found in my research. And I think the atmosphere of a book, whatever it is so important. And I want to make a point about the historical novel. It has the tendency to expand. A lot of historical novels are more than 500 pages, and sometimes even 2 volumes. I think that is because there is too much history. And my motto is, in every long book, there is a successful short one hiding to get out. And I don't know if I say something very terrible against people here who are writing very long books. I don't know, but I think that does the historical
It's
novel.
the distillation, isn't it? You're distilling down into something that has the essences.
Right.
You're looking for essences, and then going back to your sense of the atmosphere.
Yes.
And it's not, it goes beyond the research. You do the research, you immerse yourself, but then something else, something strange has to enter in. And I don't know, wake up the story.
Can I ask a general question? Is the place of research to supply the surprising? You know, I was reflecting today that eating breakfast in my hotel room, that if I was writing a novel about Jaipur in 2014, in 100 years' time, and I wanted to think of the music that would be playing in a converted Maharaja's palace, I'd probably say a morning raga was playing. I wouldn't say that the music that was playing was Raindrops Keep Falling on Your Head. Even though
Like
that's
today.
factually true. But I think that, for me, I think that's what research does,
Yes.
to provide something surprising that you wouldn't have predicted. Is that
Yeah.
possible?
It gives you gifts. I mean, it's not just a grueling labour. You know, I think I spent about a year doing research, going to archives and so on, before I began to write. And I've had other writers say, "Oh, how can you bear doing that?" But it's turning up. It gives you gifts. You know, all sorts of.
I think you have to, I mean, really the object is to make a plausible past.
Yes,
so that the
yes.
whole works, and it helps if you
Yes.
know what you're talking about. As I think you said, you don't really need to splurge it all over the
No.
wretched reader.
It's a method of entering into the world of the novel, that specific world of the novel. I mean, whether or not you decide to keep all that detail, I think seems to be irrelevant. What I think I agree with Alison that the point of doing all that research is to absorb yourself in that specific kind of context.
But sometimes research can be the death of storytelling.
Yes,
Often
it can
is,
be.
because
Yeah.
the facts sort of hunk around and
Yeah.
you've lost the sense of wonder. And we've all experienced it. You're sitting on a train and you're looking at someone that's opposite you. You don't know anything about them. You're looking at them and you can wonder about them and invent all kinds of narratives. And you can have all kinds of stories and imagine all kinds of encounters in the future with that person. We all do it. Don't shake your heads. And then that person says, "Let me introduce myself." They put their hand up, they tell you their name and they tell you their profession and where they're from. Now you have information, you have facts. That's proper autobiography, that's non-fiction. But your sense of wonder has been diffused. The balloon has lost some air. And you have to be very careful when you're a writer. I probably overdo this, but you have to be very careful over a writer not to allow facts to destroy the sense of wonder that the narrative itself is looking for.
Yes.
Tash, could I ask you? You've moved with your last book from a formal historical novel narrative to a narrative where history is on the march, but in a contemporary setting. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you see your relationship to history?
Well, I mean, a lot of my work is about how history has changed, how times have changed in Asia over the last sort of 60 or 70 years, and how people in Asia appreciate the recent past. It always took me a bit by surprise when people described my first two novels as historical novels, because particularly the second one, I didn't really think of as history. It took place mainly in the 60s, which is just before I was born. At a time that my parents really remember, you know, as newlyweds. So for them it wasn't history. And I had this personal experience with the latest one, which is set in 2010, simultaneously 2010 and 1990. And to me it was a totally contemporary novel, but I was doing a talk to some sixth form students who were born in 1990 something. And one of them said to me, "I see you're still interested in historical fiction." And of course, you know, for a 60, 17-year-old, 1990 is before there war,
Before the internet.
before the internet,
Yeah.
before the
Mobile
Yeah.
phones.
Exactly. They weren't quite sure why people were actually picking up a phone and dialing. What is the dialing thing? They weren't quite sure. And so, I mean, to me, I found that quite interesting about how, I mean, this whole notion of time being of modernity, I think, to history is sort of so. I think in so much of East Asia, history is so subservient to modernity. We like not to deal with history in a sense. And because I live mainly in London, I see how the approach in Western Europe is very different. It's about commemorating the past, whereas in a lot of Asia it's about forgetting the past.
This is the thing about W.G. Sebald, who looks at history in an entirely different way. The significant thing was that when he was 17 or 18, he was taken around some of the camps. And he said it seemed a long time ago, and it was only a year or two after, and it meant nothing to him. It took him some time to begin to be aware of that. As we know, most of his books are kind of reminiscences of the German identity, and they could be described as historical novels, but they're completely out of the box. They're not like anybody else.
Somebody once explained to me, a German once explained to me that the appeal of Sebald's novels for a German readership is partly that his German seems very pure. It seems to be a literary German from before any of the events of the German 20th century took place. My friend said he's the last German writer to describe a telephone as das Apparat rather than das Telefon. I don't know whether that's true though, but that's the point. Alison, could I ask you, your last novel, Exploded, was set in a very particular historical setting, very fascinating.
It's set, Unexploded is set in Brighton on the south coast of England from May 1940, just after the retreat from Dunkirk, the British forces being evacuated, the little boats. So, a hugely low point in the early part of the war, up to June 1941. And the reason is that was this very strange, and as for me, quite, exploring it, surreal year in Brighton, of fear, of this sort of clenched waiting for the Germans to walk up the beach, which is 10 minutes from where I live. And I suppose, I'm not, although I've written 3 historical novels, I'm not really interested in the historical novel, which is a funny sort of thing. I'm interested in using these stories that are sort of fresher, more fresh, to sort of filter our contemporary preoccupations, our contemporary anxieties. And really for me, the book was triggered on July 8th, 2005, walking through London and feeling that palpable fear after the London bombings on July 7th, the day before. And I was probably one of the first people on the tube the next morning walking through London. I had to get to the BBC for an interview. And just I was just trying to imagine, what is it like? What are we all living with when we're living with terror? But to approach our own times for me was too head-on. I think the stories are more interesting when they come at things aslant, and there are different ways of doing that. You could, to move into the fantastic. Sometimes you're coming at things aslant, but for me, to take things back into history is a way of moving into something that's fresher and stranger to us, and I want that strangeness. So yes, I've written 3 historical novels, but in fact, for their own sake, I have no interest unless they're showing us, reflecting ourselves back to us.
Many novelists who work in a historical setting have found that it's the bystander, the incidental observer, that's the useful viewpoint. Not all novelists. I mean, Jim has written a novel about Christ in the desert, who was not really a bystander. But why is that a useful point of view, the remote bystander?
I think again, it's just if you go to the centre of a story, going to the obvious place in a story isn't isn't the best way of seeing the centre. I think novels, I think short stories, for example, often deal with are exploring the fringes. We've got very often marginal characters exploring these sort of edges of what we know. Novels tend to occupy the centre of ground more, but there's something challenging about that because the centre is just more obvious. So stepping just to the left, to the right, bystanders, I think is helpful. I don't know, I just think more interesting. Yeah, I think it is, and for me, I just think, yes, I'm interested in history, but I'm not interested in the big, familiar public event for its own sake, like World War II. I've actually, people assume I must have been in love with World War II fiction. I've hardly read any World War II fiction, but what I do love being able to do with historical narratives is to take the big public event and then to look at how it filters down to the intimate or the private, which is really what I'm interested in, because it's in the personal, the private, the domestic, the intimate that we can, I think, really see the distillation again of the big public event. So World War II violence, but I really wanted to look at what does that do between a couple. How does World War II enter a house? How does 1941 enter into our most private moments in a domestic?
That could actually, sorry,
Yeah.
that would apply to Marilyn Robinson as we talked, I was thinking. You have one narrative which is about two big conversations
Yes.
in a big way. Something's going on outside the windows, it's beating on the windows of the rectory, but the two protagonists don't realize that you, the reader, begin gradually to discover what the true story is. Quite a hard trick to pull off.
It's hard, and yet it seems to be so, anything else can slightly false, because those things are never compartmentalized. The big public event and sort of private history, those things aren't compartmentalized in any of our lives. So it seems to be quite a natural way. I wouldn't quite know how to work in any other way.
It's funny, she wrote my novel.
We're picked up that spot.
Absolutely the same setting,
yes, yes.
same atmosphere,
Yes.
same idea.
Yes, let's just marry up.
Yeah.
Marry. And then you breed more historical fiction.
Is one of the secrets for the popularity of the historical novel now? Is it simply that? What would I have done if I was living at that time? I've often wondered that about if the Germans had invaded Britain,
Yeah.
and if I had been living there, would I have surrendered? Or would I have got out a revolver and gone down? I don't know. It's an impossible question to answer.
This is very, very brief, but this is along with London on the day after the bombings. It was a little line from Virginia Woolf in the diaries that triggered this, and so it's about war and and it's 1940, and Woolf says she was living she was living at this point very close to Brighton along the south coast. She left London, she and Lennon, and she simply says, nobody in their senses can believe it, yet nobody must tell the truth, so one forgets. Meanwhile, the aeroplanes are on the prowl, crossing the downs. So I thought, yet nobody must tell the truth. So I wanted to go back and try to bring, to take a familiar story that is familiar, and sort of bring back that raw, dangerous edge to things.
Yeah, Kafka has a great entry in his diary. Germany invaded, this is the first one.
Yes.
Germany invaded Russia swimming in the afternoon.
Yeah.
What else would you suggest might lie behind the rise in popularity among readers of the historical novel?
Well, I think it's maybe due to the manipulation of history that we've all been talking about. I think that's something in common that I think all of us have mentioned. That our appreciation of history isn't something it's something much more fluid. And certainly when I was younger, when I was starting out and trying to think of myself as a writer, thinking what forms I was interested in, the historical novel was the very last one I thought of, because to me, it was lots of nice costumes. It was Philippa Gregory. I mean, I'm sure that she's a lovely writer, but that's not the kind of writer I was thinking of. And I think because to me, the classic is the old-fashioned historical novel relied too much on the fidelity
Yes.
to true events,
Yes.
and it didn't really. It relied on the big events, which is why actually something like Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies are so remarkable, because they feel veritative of particular versions of events, and yet still also manage to be intimate.
And they reinvent, I suppose, the whole approach to reinventing Cromwell as a character. So I think there always has to be reinvention. You have to take the familiar story and sort of break it apart as well. And that's.
I mean, what is clear is that if you want to learn about any period of history in any country, the internet will provide the truth for you. There are plenty of great books, and there are plenty of things you can look up.
I don't really believe that.
I don't really believe that. No, I don't believe anything I say. But so the novel has got to do something different, hasn't it? It's got to try and do something that these non-fiction books can't do. And as we were talking just now, I was just thinking the way in which our lives are inhabited by the books that we read, and some of those things are really informative and really close gaps. And I was thinking about my relationship with India and my sense of India when I was a kid. And of course I knew about Calcutta and I knew about Delhi and I knew the names of places. But the name of a place that I knew best in India, which still has got reverberations in my imagination and in my sense of what is genuine, is Malgudi. Which of course is the one place amongst those that great list that doesn't exist. But it exists more fully and thoroughly in my imagination than any of the facts that I've learned and forgotten. Because that's the trouble with facts, is that they have a kind of slippery hold on us. Whereas the characters that we live with and that we associate with and feel like cousins at the end of a book, or in Narayan's case, several books, are as unforgettable as our real cousins in the real world. So I think that's the function of fiction. And we shouldn't, even though we're all sitting on the stage here and we're on a historical novel panel and we're all saying, it's not me, it's not me. And you're all thinking, I wish they'd charge us to get in here because we could demand our money back. Nevertheless, we all do use history for that higher purpose, and we're aggrandizing ourselves in saying that. But everyone in this room loves books and loves reading, and so let's not pretend we shouldn't pretend they're more powerful than they are, but they are powerful.
There's a very interesting thing here about South African novels, because I never read an apartheid. I was under a lot of pressure at various times to write. Mainly because I thought it was a very simplistic view of what was happening. But the truth is that the novelists spoke the truth while the government and everybody else didn't lie continually. My father was a newspaper editor, and he said a dead dog one night when he read something about the police. So if you wanted to look at the history of South Africa and the apartheid era, you would actually find far more about it in any of the well-known writers of the time. That said, I couldn't write that kind of novel. I didn't want to write that kind of novel, dealing specifically with an issue I very important issue. And then, if you looked at Nadine Gordimer in his own way, John Coetzee, you'd actually find a much clearer explanation of what was going on, especially except that it was in the interest of this government to falsify virtually everything they said, every trial, what they regarded as insurrection. There was nothing of the sort that had to be painted with colours. You get the impression, to digress slightly, that's what's happening still in Russia. There's an acceptable limit of freedom, but it's not the whole way.
I think one of the interesting things about novelists who take on real life historical episodes is that they divide into two. It's either the novelist who relishes the historical episode that we've all thought about and argued about and discussed a great deal over the years, like apartheid here. And then there are novelists like Neil, and I suspect like Justin, who like thank goodness, 47 minutes into the session, and it doesn't work. Well, I'm going to hold it up. And novelists who relish the historical, it's an absurdist gesture. Novelists who relish the historical episode that hasn't been gone over, that hasn't been discovered by lots of novelists. Which one would you say that you are? Can you identify?
I was so obsessed with wondering where the sound was coming. It wasn't it?
It's working outside. It's working, it's now working outside, actually. Okay. All right, I'm going to ask you a different question then. Is it possible that one of the appealing things about the historical novel is that it represents a reaction to another tendency in contemporary writing, the tendency to write about oneself in a subjective, memoir-y sort of way? Does the historical novel represent a triumph of objectivity that readers find rather a relief?
Especially if the writer is not a nice man. You hope he will write an historical novel. But no, I just wanted to add about, you brought in imagination, and the theme is imagining the past. I think that is very important. Writers are catchers of the past, so to say, and you are a writer. It's a fight against forgetting. I think that is important in novel. As a writer, you try to get grip on the things that were. It is melancholy, I think. Writing is pure melancholy.
I think it's still, I think all readers need any kind of, any form of fiction. They want, I think it's a novel, but people want subjectivity, they don't want objectivity. I think the thing about the autobiographical novels, the novel about the self, is that there came a point in which, and they still exist, where these novels get too, they're too smug, they're too self-regarding, and I think what the historical context does is that it gives people the illusion that it's objective, but actually what still underpins the reading experience is that subjectivity, that intimacy.
There's an historian called Elizabeth D. Armagh. I don't know if any of you are cultural theorist and historian. And as a very sort of respected historian, she's
Don't repeat it.
Okay, apparently it's all right. Sorry outside of that. But she's an interesting, kind of wonderful traitor to her own kind, historians, because she's there's been a work called The Sequel to History, and she makes a case as an historian of the historical novel being a truer, a better vehicle, a better tool for getting history, because it allows for the provisional, it allows for the subjective, it allows for many sort of plates to be spun in the air and to sort of so for her, the provisionality, the complexity of an historical novel, the fact that there isn't, that no novel wants to have sort of one meaning. For her, she makes a case by going through Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is, I think, one of the best historical novels of the 20th century. And she goes back to Beloved, and she shows how it's much more than its issues. It transcends history through transformation, through Morrison's colossal act of the imagination. And so she's a sort of rebel historian who says the historical novel is truer word, more true.
Can I just my mind has been set spinning by something Otto said, which I think reflects a bit on the. Is this working? Oh, reflects on the historical novel. Otto said that if there was a nasty man, an unpleasant person, you would hope that he wouldn't write an autobiographical novel, but that he'd write a historical novel. My feeling is exactly the opposite. What you don't want is to read a novel by a nice man, which is autobiographical.
No.
Because that would be a happy life, and that would be no divorces, that would be no murders, no stabbings, no fights, and no adultery. And the same sort of, and that is the death of publishing, I promise you. The Kindle doesn't come close. And the same sort of principle applies to the historical novel. And it's worth thinking about what effect this has on our understanding of history. Because the historical novel loves famine more than it loves fullness of a ripe harvest. It loves war more than it loves peace. It loves people being turned off their land rather than people being settled. It loves slavery even. The historical novel, like any other novel, is going to want to visit the dark parts of humankind and the dark parts of human experience. And perhaps it will be more keen to visit those areas than the genuinely academic history. And so it will be presenting a rather darker and more partial view of our past than a true historian ever will. And anyway, that's what I've been thinking of sitting here, and I'm not sure, therefore, whether the novel is doing us any favours.
But all stories need trouble. There's no story without trouble.
No.
So we don't know whether that history or contemporary would need trouble. That's it.
I'm very conscious that I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I just want to ask one final philosophical, pseudo-philosophical, maybe not philosophical at all question. Do you think of the historical novel as predominantly a mirror, a reflection of our present circumstances, or do you think of it as a window into the alien and the exotic?
This is like getting an exam question. It's making you don't know which one's going to get you the marks. Don't flunk it. By the way, about Jim, I once described him as a near genius, and he complained to an interviewer. He said, "Why the near?" I just wanted to dog him in. No, I treat historical novels like any other novel. I don't think they're a window into the past, although I've had a lot of illumination from Sebald and John Coetzee and other people. There are aspects, as you rightly said, where you get the texture of the time. And I think the only job you have as a writer, both a historical novelist or contemporary novelist, which is my normal mode, is to make a plausible reconstruction that people can identify with. It's obviously never going to be totally accurate. I mean, for example, Richard the Lionheart didn't speak English. Even though he's the iconic English king, he didn't even speak contemporary French. He spoke, and I don't know how to render that in a novel. Although I did include a large chunk of it in my book, which has obviously put loads of people off. But nonetheless, you've got to try and try and create suspension of disbelief. And I very much like Jim's point about when you're reading, you can identify the fictional character more closely than with somebody you actually know. And that's a terrific trick. That is really the secret of novels, I think. And I think it applies equally to historical novels as contemporary novels.
I forgot the question. What is that question again?
I'd ask whether you regard the historical novel as predominantly a way to reflect present circumstances,
Yes.
or a window into exotic and disappeared ways of life.
It's really interesting. So, I think I'm just echoing what's already been said. But yes, it's creating enough of a reflection, enough accuracy that we believe when we go with the story. And yes, I love the way we can move into the sense of the alien or the surprising or the unexpected by going back to little-known stories within history, and that we can sort of try on those clothes as contemporary people and sort of live our lives, live the contemporary through the historical. So, but really, what I'm always interested in, whether it's contemporary work that I'm doing or historical, is a sense of the strangeness in the everyday, the unexpected, the strangeness that takes us back to the human, really. So I want the surreal, because the surreal is part of the way, I don't know, I find life incredibly surreal.
I'm going to plump for one. I'm going to sort of run against grain and say, it's about ourselves, it's about our present selves. I don't think anyone's genuinely, really, really interested in inhabiting the past unless it in some way reflects, or even principally reflects how we feel. Particularly if you read to establish a personal connection with what we're reading. We're not reading to establish a personal connection with something we don't know about. I think we read fact for that. I also want to run against the grain with the previous point, which is that we need unhappiness to write great books, and that without adultery and all the rest of it, publishing will fail. I think that's got me thinking about how to write an unfailingly upbeat novel. Maybe, but so I think that's a challenge for the next one. All my books are very, very upbeat, by the way.
Well, writing a book about happiness, nobody is
happy with that.
no. That is the most difficult way to do. But I just want to answer you after you quote about Jim.
Yeah.
I would love to read a book, an autobiographical book of you.
I've been married for 40 years. I've never been ill. I'm really ashamed to say I've never cheated.
Stop writing.
I'm very happy, and you're all asleep already.
Just the end of this responsible session, which I should have said has been very kindly sponsored by the Embassy of the Netherlands. Just at this point, I would like to throw the floor open to your questions. I'm sure you have a lot. Gentlemen over there, stand up and shout.
I'm very interested in what you said about contemporary consciousness, and I just wondered whether any of you felt that there were good old historical novels, because I can remember this criticism attenuating all the praise for Wolf Hall, saying that we'll come to see that historical fiction says more about our own time than about the time about which it's written. So I wonder whether there's some old historical fiction that stands, whatever test that might be, which is interesting.
It is striking, if I can just add to that very often in careers of novelists in the past, it's their historical novels that were most rated by their contemporaries and the ones that have sunk from view. Romola was the novel that George Eliot was paid the most for. So does anyone have any favourite old historical novels?
I have one. It's because it's sponsored by the Embassy of the Netherlands. There's one famous writer, Louis Couperus. He was translated into English. He was writing in the around 1900, and his historical novels were sublime. And he was the Emperor of China. He became the High Priest of Egypt. He was the historical figure he wrote about. And he is denying everything I said about don't go too much into historical research, because he had the power about the historical facts so good, so well that you believe where you were when you read the books, and he had no influence at all in the Netherlands. He was a lonely wolf, and in the literary polders of Holland, he had no fame at all till now. He is still read, and the people love him.
The book that I'd like to mention is, I've mentioned it before at this festival, is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And the reason I mention that as being of interest is here is a novel which records events which have not been properly recorded anywhere before. There are English versions, of course, and French versions and such like of the colonisation of Africa. But an African version of it, contemporary versions don't exist as far as I know. There's folklore and there are handed-on stories. So Chinua Achebe's version of the coming of the Europeans to Africa is a historical novel, but of course entirely imagined, but brilliant. and short, so you can all read it.
Another question, please. Lady in the front.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering that, so much of history is and can be dubious as we learn it, and so much of it can be skewed and a great travesty of the truth. And I was just wondering, as novelists, do you ever labor under the pressures of doing justice to history, or should you be unencumbered by any such obligations?
I certainly, yes, I was very conscious and quite frightened, really, with this novel taking on that period, that I was very conscious 1940 to 41 is still within living memory. And this goes back to Jim's point about, what's difficult or awkward. There was a terrific responsibility, and I felt many more people owned that story more than I did. But I did want to get back to something I felt was disappearing with it, which was a sense of, I don't know, the nostalgia for the Second World War in England, and the sense of the Blitz spirit, and kind of all the newsreels where everyone looked so sort of jolly on VE Day. And it seems to me that the reality of living with war, living with threat of physical invasion or violence, had sort of been smoothed out of or photoshopped out, or is increasingly being photoshopped out. And I wanted to get back to a sense of that threat that was both constantly distant and ever present at the same time. So I did want to try to get back to something rougher and edgier about that period, as a way of thinking about our own time. I suppose. A bit dull, but yeah, I did. I had a man last week, a friend of a friend, sort of say to me at a dinner party, "I have to speak to you." He said, "I have to speak to you about the sort of, there's a terrible error in the book." And I thought, oh God, here we go. Oh my God, can I just go over to the drinks table, please? Please don't follow. He followed. And he was highly annoyed that I'd used fish and chips. I referred to a chip carton blowing down the street. And in fact, I had originally had chip paper, like newspaper, but I went back to a Graham Greene in Brighton Rock, which was a chip carton in 1938. So but this man was saying it's impossible, they wouldn't, we were gathering a crowd at the dinner party as I came under attack for my chip carton. So people do feel, quite a sense of ownership. And I'm not English, I was raised in Canada. My father and my uncles were in the war, so I have a sense of it doesn't feel historical if it's in my father's period. It doesn't feel, that's again memory, living memory. So yeah,
No, we're running out of time. I think we might have time for one more question. Lady in the mic.
So it seems to me like you're especially gifted.
Speak up, please.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay, I'll just try.
Okay.
So it seems to me like you're especially gifted when it comes to kind of tapping into this intuitive and psychic bridge that exists between a public event and a private emotional event in life. But when you're examining an event in history, how can someone who would like to potentially write historical fiction bring that, invite that intuitive understanding of life? What do you spend time thinking besides just reading a lot about it and less over?
So if you're writing about the great public events, something very familiar and very big, how does one as a writer reach the human or the intimate or private detail and flip those? For me, it's immersing myself. So it's really immersing myself in that world, for, as I said, perhaps for a year through the research, immersing myself, and then it's the same work I would do in character. Do you think how best to explain it? It's really just trying to always push past the obvious and to take things deeper. It's almost archaeological. It's like a dig. An archaeological dig through your characters. And I have to keep looking at myself, thinking that's not honest enough on the page. That character, it's not honest enough yet. As I keep digging it down, it's hard, it's an intuitive thing, digging it down into the sort of strata of your character, and putting them in a bedroom sometimes, because, you know, we all do have sex lives, and we all have intimate lives. I think we sort of do. And surely in our most intimate moments is when our characters flare, you know, it's when we see the essences of who we are in the most intimate. So I wouldn't know how to write a character without going into the small, the private, the intimate. That's where a character sort of, you know, where they show themselves, where they literally reveal themselves.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to you for putting up with these difficult circumstances and to this wonderful panel. Can I stress that all their books are on sale in the tent, and it's always much better to ask an author to sign a copy of their book than the back of a bus ticket.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Before we leave, I just want to let you know that the authors, we have set up a signing table outside. So you can follow me to the signing table. Once more, thanks to the Embassy of the Netherlands.